I think if we cast our mind back just 4 or 5 months, many of the political challenges facing the Albanese government did not even exist. But now we've got, a global energy crisis. We've got a war that seems to be going for much longer than a lot of people think it is necessary to. You've got a government trying to create a budget in an atmosphere of not knowing what the budget parameters are. And we've got today the IMF warning of global recession. So you put all those things together, and quite a few others that we could go through if we wanted. Things are starting to look tough for the Labor government in terms of its ability to achieve its aim, which was simply to have a good term, a strong economy, cost of living relief, more services for people, and then be re-elected in its hope. Instead, it's still got all those plans, but it's also got a lot of obstacles.
G'day everyone, and welcome back to In the Know. I'm your host Evan Schwarten, and with me as always is the numbers man George Hassanakis. G'day George.
Hi Evan, great to be back again.
And joining us today is our first official guest on this podcast. It's our good friend Matthew Franklin, who's the political editor at Capital Brief, which in my opinion is one of the best political and business publications in Australia right now. Highly recommend a subscription. I'll get that out of the way. Matthew's also one of the most senior political journalists in Australia, having worked for The Australian and the Courier Mail before a lengthy stint working for Anthony Albanese. But now he's back in journalism, and we're really glad to have you here. G'day, Matthew.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Now, we've got a lot to discuss in this episode, but I want to kick things off with our headline topic, which is our new Capital Brief / DemosAU poll, which shows a sizable shift against Labor, really, for a month-on-month change, to the point where they're now neck and neck with One Nation. And the coalition's also starting to recover some ground. George, can you start us off by talking us through the findings?
Thanks, Evan. Look, we polled just over 1,400 people between 9 to 14 April, and our national headline primary vote figures were Labor on 26%, down 3% on our last discrete poll in February. One Nation is on 26%, so tied for first place on primary, but they're also down 2% from our last poll in February. The coalition has had a bit of a rebound under their new leader. They're on 23%, and that's up 2% from our February poll. And the Greens are on 13%, they're up 1%, and others are on 12%, and they're up 2%. So what this means, as you know, in our with DemosAU polls, we don't give a two-party preferred at this time. What we do is we provide a seat estimate based on our previous MRP and using a uniform swing from that measure. And we have a seat range for Labor between 68 and 78 seats. So long story short, within this poll's results, it's either a narrow Labor majority, a Labor minority, or a non-Labor government led by One Nation is also a possibility.
That's that's pretty extraordinary. It's a massive change from 1 year ago or even a few months ago. Matthew, can I get your thoughts on this? We've got here a so-called minor party that's now ahead of one of the major parties and level pegging with the other. How do you think the different political parties and people you talk to will be responding to this poll?
I think our friends in the Liberal and National parties will be slightly happy because, as you noted, there's a small increase for them. I think if you're One Nation, you're wondering, well, have we peaked? But 26 is pretty good for a minor party, so I think they'd be happy. They'd always be happy for more, but 26% is pretty good for them. I think the bad news here is for Labor. Labor is on 26, down 3, the same as One Nation, but of course they're the government and they've got some real challenges ahead. I think if we cast our mind back just 4 or 5 months, many of the political challenges facing the Albanese government did not even exist. But now we've got, a global energy crisis. We've got a war that seems to be going for much longer than a lot of people think it is necessary to. You've got a government trying to create a budget in an atmosphere of not knowing what the budget parameters are. And we've got today the IMF warning of global recession. So you put all those things together, and quite a few others that we could go through if we wanted. Um, Things are starting to look tough for the Labor government in terms of uh, its ability to achieve its aim, which was simply to have a good term, a strong economy, cost of living relief, more services for people, and then be re-elected in its hope. Instead, it's sort of got all those plans, but it's also has got a lot of obstacles in front of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that cost of living thing, I suppose, is really interesting here, or really critical here, because this is politics doesn't always resonate with people, but when they're paying more at the fuel bowser, or in grocery prices or whatever it is, but when it's impacting them on that level, that's significant. George, is that what you think's driving this slide in Labor's support?
Yes, I do think it is fuel prices, which have risen due to the Middle Eastern war, and specifically the closure, or at least the holding up of traffic on the Strait of Hormuz. So, and ultimately, they do government, if it is seen as um, not being able to deal with this sort of crisis, then they all get marked down. Despite, look, to be fair, not just the federal Labor government, but state governments around the country have been trying their best to say, look, this is what we're doing about the fuel crisis. We're bringing more fuel to Australia. We're increasing refinery capacity. But at this stage, it seems like Labor is suffering from an erosion of support because, well, in short, people are doing it tough.
Yeah. George, we also asked people about their thoughts on the three main leaders. So Anthony Albanese, Angus Taylor for the Coalition, and Pauline Hanson for One Nation. Can you take us through those results?
Yes, sure. Look, uh, we had questions on two levels. Firstly, there was the baseline question: what is your opinion of the following people? And they could answer positive, negative, or neutral. And we asked them of Albanese, Taylor, and Hanson. Albanese is on 26% positive and 46% negative. And that is basically, it's not a good place to be in, very simply put, but it does show that he is suffering from negative perceptions, not just from the right of centre, but also from the people who don't align themselves, and to some extent, Green supporters. This has always been an issue with Labor leaders when it comes to personal satisfaction. They usually win elections 50 to 55% of two-party preferred vote, but a large hunk of that are Green voters, and those Green voters sit on the fence, and it comes across as poor personal ratings.
Um,
Angus
and-
Taylor,
oh, sorry, keep going, mate.
yeah,
Apologies.
Angus Taylor is on 25% positive, 28% negative. Not much change from February, but does show that he has been seen as a fresh start, if not a blank slate. Hanson is on 34% positive and 39% negative, compared to in February, 37-38. So Hanson's appeal is starting to come off the boil. Matthew was mentioning maybe there's a peaking there. Well, we always can tell the peak after the fact, but that is quite possible. But we also asked for each of those three leaders what they thought, whether 8 attributes applied to them. And they were arrogant, likable, trustworthy, in touch with ordinary Australians, competent, has a vision for Australia, decisive and strong, and in control of their party. And all of those attributes go towards perceptions of leadership. And to put it in a nutshell, Albanese's attributes are underwater, sometimes quite significantly, and Angus Taylor is going around the middle. Par, that is zero, right? Equal yes, equal no. And Hanson is seen as very strong when it comes to having a vision for Australia, decisive and strong, which has a net positive rating of 30% or a little more than that. So there's basically, in terms of the attributes people apply to the Prime Minister, he is being overshadowed by Hanson in some respects. But if I could just boil it down, it goes back to this saying, you know where she stands, but do you like where she stands? If we drill down to those things, has a vision for Australia, 59% agree. Decisive and strong, 58% agree. But their primary vote's only at 26%. And this needs to be kept in mind. Leadership attributes aren't the only factor which impinges on parties' levels of support.
George, can I ask you a question?
Yep.
Is it the case that, some of the gloss, as you say, is coming off the Prime Minister's ratings? Is that, do you think, because at a time when we're in a global crisis, people are anxious and angry, it's natural that they're going to look to the leader and mark him down, whatever job he's doing?
Mm, Not necessarily, because if there is, it depends on what the crisis is about and how that impacts uh, the values of the leader and the values of the population at large. I think it's more about Albanese has tried very hard in the tradition of Howard and Hawke to come across as somebody who doesn't rock the boat and is a competent manager. But unfortunately, in this day and age, especially with a persistent cost of living crisis, to use the term, or persistent inflationary environment, which we haven't seen for decades, uh, that is rubbing off on his leadership in a negative way. There are plenty of people saying, "Well, look, why can't this be fixed?" Now, you and I know that um, you know, dealing with inflation is not as simple as flicking a switch, but the pain is still felt out there, and that is impacting on his leadership ratings in a negative way.
Matthew, on that, if you don't mind me asking this, given you know the Prime Minister quite well, if you were working for him right now, what would you be advising him to do to turn these numbers around?
Wow, that's turning back the clock. I think I think really what he's got to do, Evan, is just keep going the way that he is. He's got to try and provide assurance to people. As we said at the start, this is a chaotic. It's the only word you could use. It's a chaotic atmosphere in which he's trying to operate. Um, and it would be where if Angus Taylor was the leader too. You've got some correct. You've got some serious difficulties in front of you, and you've got the president of the United States um, causing daily global sensations that sort of get in the way. I think there's not the only thing that the government can do is keep on going and try to do the best that it can. Hope that things sort themselves out in time for it to rebuild its stocks with voters. I don't think that looking at today's poll, you'd have to say the government's in terrible trouble or the doldrums. I think it's a reflection of where we're at this moment in time. But um, it's a bit like when COVID was on. What could Scott Morrison do? He just had to keep working through the problems. Unfortunately for him, he had a couple of difficulties near the end, particularly where it came to sourcing vaccines that went to his performance. But if you are a government trying your hardest, you're doing the best you can. Obviously, your political opponents will attack you, but um, in circumstances where your options are somewhat limited, all you can do is keep going, and you've got to try and provide some leadership. So I think Anthony Albanese has been trying to do that. Last recently at the press club, he and with that telecast broadcast he did, telling people they didn't have to worry just before Easter. That's what he was trying to do, but I didn't think it was very well executed, and I think he might have frightened some people. But people are looking for leadership from a prime minister, and that's what he needs to provide.
You mentioned Donald Trump there, and I think actually it's probably a good time to actually go into that a bit more because we've also published, with Capital Brief, some polling on people's views on Trump. He wildly negatively viewed. I think 19% of Australians think we should have a prime minister like Donald Trump, which is down from 27% last year. I mean, he was never popular, but he's plumbing the depths even further, and that's also showing up in faith in the US alliance. So only 27% of people at the moment think that the US is a reliable military ally for Australia, which is a sort of points to a huge existential question for Australia, I think. Um, but given that unpopularity of Trump and a lot of these problems we have are caused by Donald Trump, do you think one way that might actually boost Anthony Albanese's popularity would be to draw more of a distance between himself and Donald Trump and actually call out some of these facts that, the reason you're paying more at the Bowser is because of Donald Trump?
Well, it's tough with Donald Trump because it's like handling a taipan, isn't it? You just don't know what's going to happen next. But I noted last week, particularly last week, uh, when Donald Trump started talking about tonight a civilization will end, that was too much for Anthony Albanese. He described those words as completely inappropriate. He's in a bit of a bind in that he needs to kick Trump on side for a whole range of reasons. But the more wild, the more unlikely some of the things that Trump is saying are, the more difficult it is not to distance yourself from him. Um, Nobody, I think, would really want to cuddle up to somebody who said civilization is going to end tonight. And you could see on Anthony Albanese's face when he was doing his media around that, the discomfort that he felt. Um, so it is really very difficult for him, but I think this poll the results on this Donald Trump poll will confirm for him what I think he already suspects, and that is that people generally understand that Donald Trump's a difficult character. They generally understand that it's the Prime Minister's job to represent Australia as best he can and get the best he can for Australia from the United States. But I think anybody watching now, he's now attacking the Pope. I think anybody watching now knows that that is a very difficult task, but one that I think, in some ways, but not in all ways, Anthony Albanese is being drawn to. Let's say, for the sake of, in the case of the civilization is about to end, for the sake of decency, he had to say that.
Oh, 100%. George, so obviously it's a challenging position for Anthony Albanese, but what do you think about the implications here for our own, for the parties on the right who are maybe seen as, I think that was one of the problems Peter Dutton had last year, was seen as Trump light by some people at a time when Donald Trump was very unpopular, even though he's less popular now. Do you think this is a potential albatross for Pauline Hanson, given, we've seen her toasting with champagne for Donald Trump's election at one point? She's been to Mar-a-Lago. Is there a risk that some of this rubs off on her?
Well, yes, but it's more about dealing with her supporters or the people that are willing to vote for her. Let's drill down into our question: Australia needs a prime minister like Donald Trump. So in our poll here in April, it was 19% agree, 12% don't know, 69% agree. Just on this question alone, it's very polarizing. That don't know figure for a non-voting intention question is relatively low. But you break it down by people's current voting intentions. And, in terms of Labor voters, it's very one-sided. 84% disagree with that statement, only 10% agree. But when you have a look at One Nation, it's 41% agree, 46% disagree. They're almost split down the middle. And you have similar sorts of figures with our other questions about whether we should distance ourselves from Donald Trump or be close to him. That One Nation supporter base is basic. The current One Nation voters are split down the middle. And to navigate that is going to be, going forward, is going to be very, very tricky. For argument's sake, if the coalition and One Nation had different positions on something Trump did, and it was very stark and a high profile action, that could drive a fair whack of support back to the coalition. So it is a very delicate issue for One Nation in terms of trying to keep the voters they have now and try to put themselves in an election winning position. Um, in terms of the coalition, only 21% of current coalition supporters agree that Australia needs a prime minister like Donald Trump. 65% disagree. So a lot of people who've stuck with the coalition are no fans with Trumpism. And that's actually a warning sign for Angus Taylor. You know, dog whistling or no dog whistling, to try and side yourself with Donald Trump could be very problematic for him. But that being said, it's a bigger problem for One Nation.
And Andrew Hastie's actually been quite interesting on this, hasn't he? The coalition front
Yeah, it
bencher,
has.
Andrew Hastie, he's been quite open in despite being someone who probably has a lot in common with Donald Trump in terms of policies or ideology, or MAGA ideology, I suppose I could say. He's been quite staunch in calling out some of Donald Trump's behaviour, hasn't he?
Yes. And in terms of other Western conservative figures, he's not exactly Robinson Crusoe.
Yeah.
Like, even some of the parties which are in Western Europe, whether it be Reform in the UK or the National Front in France or AFD in Germany, they have tried to give themselves some distance with Donald Trump. So it is, it's it's not it's not necessarily breaking new ground in the global context, but in terms of public opinion, I would say Hastie has been shrewd in his analysis.
Mm. But even Georgia Maloney's now falling out with Trump, which is that's how far things have gotten. So, one of his biggest supporters, he's losing people, even on the far right globally, quite
Yeah.
quickly. When you do things like attack the Pope, that's going to happen, I suppose.
Yes.
Matthew, one of we've talked about the poll results earlier, and primarily it's arguably One Nation's in quite a good position. They're tied with Labor in first position, but they have lost a couple of percentage points at the same time that the coalition's lifted a couple of percentage points. I think this is the first time in a long time that we've released a poll that has One Nation going backwards, first since before the election, and vice versa for the coalition. It's the first time in a long time we haven't had them going backwards. This comes obviously a month or so after they replaced Susan Lee with Angus Taylor and David Littleproud with Matthew Canavan. Do you think that reset's working?
I think it is for both of the parties, but in different ways. Starting with Matt Canavan, I think he's quite a breath of fresh air. When I say that, not necessarily referring to his policies, which are well known. I mean, he's pushed them for a long time, but he's got lots of energy. He's been working very hard from the moment he got the gig. He made a beeline to the National Press Club where he, you know, braved the questions of the packed journalists, which is pretty brave thing to do so early in your term when you don't have policies to talk about, because those can be quite chaotic affairs as well. I think Angus Taylor's taking a different approach. He seems to have been uh, uh, adopting a kind of a slow start. He's not jumping out of the gates to be everywhere. I was doing plenty of um, interviews in communities, but he's not doing a lot of national media. I haven't seen him at the press club. Uh, so, but I do think that really what we could be talking about, the start of, is competition, and that's what politics is about. We need people to stand up and tell us their ideas. I'm not sure Susan Lee, when she was in that role, was telling us much about the policy. As I just said, I think Angus Taylor's going about it quite slowly, but this week he's talking about immigration. That's an area that's heavily contested with One Nation and the coalition, and will be critical to the election result, in my opinion. So I think that both of the new opposition leaders have had a positive start. I'm not saying that they're 10 out of 10, but they're heading in the right direction. And if they really want to win, politics is a competitive game, isn't it? You got to get out there and you've got to tell people your ideas and you've got to convince them. And while they are trying to do that, they shouldn't forget they have a Labor government that's got, although the money's getting tighter because of the global situation. But they've got a story to tell about increased spending on health, increased spending on training. They do have a positive story to tell. So the coalition and One Nation, if they really want to be competitive, they do have to do more than just talk about rhetoric. They need to come up with policy ideas, and we're starting to see signs that the coalition is wanting to do that.
I think that's really interesting. George, we have done some polling on those people who had switched from the coalition to One Nation before, and then the two real reasons were a general loss of faith in the coalition, the scene that they just weren't performing, and immigration was the other issue. Do you think the way they've positioned themselves now does serve them well to start winning some of those? Is that a problem for One Nation? Are they now at a point where One Nation's had kind of the field to themselves, arguably in a way, on that side of politics? Are they now, they're now going to have to fight for those supporters?
In terms of whether we are seeing fertile ground for a coalition comeback, I think there are green shoots. Definitely. Definitely. Just the mere fact that they've closed the gap from our February poll with One Nation from 7 percentage points to 3 is important. According to our seat estimate, they've bounced up from 9 to 17 or 9 to 16 in the MRP to 16 to 30. So, and One Nation's come back a bit to 40 to 51. So there are definitely some green shoots there. Angus Taylor does not have solid negative ratings on any real leadership attribute, but he is, in terms of his leadership profile, he has a clean slate, and he seems to be putting in the work day in, day out, to try and improve his and the coalition's position. So yes, I would say there are encouraging signs, but it is still early days yet.
You mentioned it. Oh, sorry, you mentioned our MRP there. I should just say that was our model based on polling between mid-January
January, March,
and early March. Showed I think the end result was a clear Labor majority was the most likely
yes,
outcome.
yes,
And
yes, that's right.
coalition down to as little as 9 seats. I think we had it.
Yes, that's right. Let me just pull this back up here. Holster always has their spreadsheet at the ready. So look, the ranges were Labor on 77 to 86. So they've come back effectively 10 seats in this poll. One Nation 46 to 55. So they've come back about 5 seats in this poll. The coalition 9 to 17. And they've gone up about, well, it's not as easy as a simple figure because of the range there. Like they're starting to become competitive in what I would call the median seats in the battle of One Nation. So they were left with some of their very safe fiefdoms last time, but now they're fighting back in outer metropolitan and in some regional centres. So the take-home message from this is one that the coalition is regaining some of the ground it has lost, and I do think it's not just strategy from the front man or the leader of the coalition, but it's also the fact of that we are in a global crisis at the moment, and that can reflect strongly on parties of government. We saw that in COVID, especially in the early days, where votes went from minor parties back to major parties. So in that sense, I would not be surprised that the fuel crisis and the coalition's response to it has helped them in the polls so far.
It shows how volatile things really are at the moment. Now we've got the three, I'm calling them 3 main parties. I'm calling One Nation a main party at this point, are all in the 20s, right? They're all in between 20 and 30%. And a couple of percentage points can make a big difference at this point. We're a long way from the next election, obviously. But it really shows how tricky this situation is politically and the waters that the political parties have to navigate. Matthew, one thing I'd like to ask you: you had a front row seat of the original One Nation surge in Queensland in 1998. What are some lessons we can draw from that, and what lessons do you think One Nation might have drawn from that in terms of how that went?
Well, I have to stress, guys, I was a very young man back then. Um, no, I was working at the Courier Mail, and it was the weirdest election I'd ever seen because Pauline Hanson had previously been elected to the federal parliament. We're being swamped by Asians was her speech that attracted a lot of attention. She then ran candidates in the Queensland election. Um, and as I recall, Evan, you'll probably be able to correct me. I think it was 11 seats they won.
11, yeah.
Yeah. So, but what we noticed there was they were in disarray from day one. None of them had any experience as politicians, which might not be a bad thing, but from the perspective of trying to run an orderly organization, it just did not work. Pauline Hanson herself was not the leader because she was still in the federal parliament. And you had all these people from disparate backgrounds, anti-politicians, let's say, again, not in a nasty way, let's call them anti-politicians. And they got there and they found, politics is a difficult job, and it fell apart within, I think a couple of months. The lesson there for the major parties was do not believe your own rhetoric. They were taken way too lightly in that election, One Nation. The polls were all saying it, but well, no, that couldn't happen. People said there's no way that can happen. But it did. The lesson for Pauline Hanson's One Nation out of that election was if you're in a position where you're going to win some seats and become a serious player, do a bit of work on pre-selections. Get serious about checking the backgrounds of the people you're putting up for elections. That doesn't mean you can't put forward, let's say, politicians, but it doesn't mean they need to have a relatively clean background, and they need to be able to understand that politics is a team game. You can't just go off. You can't be a member one day and decide, well, I didn't like this, I'm going. It's a serious undertaking, and I think we're starting to see that a bit. I think the decision to recruit Barnaby Joyce, he was a willing recruit who had had enough of the Nats, but he does understand a bit more about how political parties work. He does understand about what how you can say things in the media that might enliven your base, but actually kill you in the national media. And I think he's part of him being there is to help with that, let's say, professionalization of One Nation's campaign and its selection and of candidates and the way that it presents itself to the public. And I definitely think that is a lesson that Barnaby learned from that period. But let's just see if it can hold together. It's always been uh, an iffy thing with One Nation.
It has. They've got a track record of really struggling to maintain MPs that get elected, or MPs or candidates having troubles with police and so on. Like, I mean, it is extremely hard to build a new political party or to build something from the ground up. It's extraordinarily hard, right? That's why it very rarely happens in this country. So I guess that's the big question for the next couple, or one of the big questions the next couple of years is can they sustain this momentum, right?
Yeah, it's also why even the main parties have such strict standards of discipline. So,
We-
if you're in the Labor Party, you don't vote the right way, they kick you out. Um, uh, that sounds pretty harsh, and it is. And it's not the case in all of the parties. But the point is, if you can't control your members, particularly if you see yourself as a party of government, you won't be seen as a party of government. You'd be seen as a rabble.
That's a really excellent point, I think, Matthew. I think that just about wraps things up for us. But there is one thing I'd like to do, and that's take a look at what's been happening globally. There's been some interesting election news internationally with the historic defeat of Viktor Orban in Hungary. Uh, George, yeah, some people are talking about this. I should say Viktor Orban, for those that don't know, is a very much in the Trump kind of mold, very very right wing, very populist, lots of allegations of corruption, with a very strong hold on the democracy there, I suppose you would say. Uh, some people have seen his defeat. Some people on the left, I suppose, have seen his defeat as a sign that the tide is turning against right wing populism. George, do you think that's the case, or is this simply, a case of a long term government being defeated, basically, which is, is what you would expect to happen at some point?
Look, the simple answer is it's a long-term government that's been defeated. They got into trouble with certain government decisions. I believe pardoning of people who involved with child sex abuse, that sort of thing. But most importantly, there was a big inflation spike. The Fidesz and the Orban government got mugged by that early on. A few years ago, got it up well into double digits. But that being said, there are a few take-home messages. One, I do concur with sentiments about whether and sentiments that appealing to domestic hip pocket concerns, that's important, yes, but also uh, uh, the opponent that won, Mr. McGar, he was very nationalistic. He would run around waving flags and that sort of thing. I think in terms of implications for right-wing populism, right-wing populists do not have a monopoly on nationalism, and they don't have a lock on it. Counter-arguments with a nationalist focus or nationalist emphasis can work against right-wing populists. So, look, I think that is probably the take-home message beyond the usual swings of the electoral pendulum, usually dictated by ages of governments or economic conditions. Nationalism or nationalist arguments can be used against right-wing populists.
We have seen a degree of that, I suppose, with even on the Labor side in terms of talking about, the Australian manufacturing, sort of a slight embrace of protectionism. Do you think that that's kind of the world where we're moving towards, or do you think that's a smart idea? I suppose is probably the better question, to be
Well,
talking more in those terms.
we saw similar things about that in infrastructure in the Biden administration, and it didn't stop a change of government last time. It can help, but it's not a silver bullet.
What do you think, Matthew? Is that do you think that's something that Anthony Albanese would be thinking about or having his mind? I mean, obviously he came up with the manufacturing strategy there. I forget the name of it. Sorry, but you might remember it.
Future made in Australia.
Future made in Australia. There we go. Do you think that's something that is he's very much aware of? That
Yeah, I do. It can appeal to people's sense of nationalism. We should be able to make our own stuff here, as politicians have been saying for years. And I think that, um, but but what I don't think people understand when you say that is that it normally means subsidies and they have to pay to have that future made in Australia. I'm not sure people get their head around that. I know that the coalition will be attacking the government's policies in that space. And I found very interesting that at the press club here in Canberra the other day when Matt Canavan gave a speech there, he was talking about tariffs and protectionism. One of his nationalist colleagues sidled up to me and said, "This is just the future made in Australia with a different name." He
not
was
a
only
fan of his, I assume.
no, he was half joking. I think. I mean, we were just having a chat, but the point that he was making is it's the same. Uh, Canavan is trying to appeal to the same sentiments that we've just been talking about, possibly, but with a different style of rhetoric, more down home. But I do think that in a world where you've got Pauline Hanson saying, um, rampaging through the political landscape, that is talking about Aussies first. they need to respond in that way. They need to be able to say, we have a plan, and the plan is about creating jobs for you, and it's based on us building stuff here. The problem remains, as it always has. Let's go back to the car manufacturing industry, and now to to power infrastructure. Someone's got to pay in the end, and in the end, it's taxpayers. And once they realize that, I think they get unimpressed with all of them.
I think that's absolutely right. I think voters, though, will never take accountability for their own views on this. Like, we'll all say we need more Australian manufacturing and we need to do more to support it, but that doesn't mean we won't punish a prime minister who blows the budget on doing that, right? And that's all we've got time for today. Thanks, Matthew, for joining us. Thanks, George,
My
as always,
pleasure.
for your
Okay.
time. Please let us know your thoughts in the comments. Love to hear your thoughts on anything we've discussed in today's episode. And please don't forget to subscribe to In the Know on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. We'll see you soon.